Hello there, welcome to my guide for painting the Star Wars Shatterpoint Make the Impossible Possible Sqaud pack. As you can see, the first thing I've done is sprayed them all with some matte white spray from Colourforge. Then I'm going to start with Hera and I'm going to use some Sqaud yellow to paint her trousers. And then I'll give it a wash with some Yenden yellow contrast paint. Moving on to Chopper, I'm going to use some Morghast bone to paint his body, which I will wash with some Army Painter soft tone. The little astromech that he's flying away from, I'm going to use some grey sear, and I'll wash him with some thinned down Nuln oil. For Sabrine's top, I'm going to use some Mechanicus Standard Grey. And for her boots and the straps of her shoulder pads and knee pads, I'm going to use a Baton Black. I'll then wash these areas with some Nuln oil. Moving back to Hera, I will relayer the Sqaud yellow just to brighten things up a bit, making sure I avoid all of the recesses. Then I'll use a 50-50 mix of Sqaud yellow and Dawn yellow for the first set of highlights, followed by Dawn yellow just by itself for the last. For Chopper, I'm going to use the Morghast bone just to neaten things up a little bit. Once again, taking care to avoid all of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast bone and Wraith bone. Next will be Wraith bone just by itself. And then finally, edge highlighting with a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white. After I've finished Chopper's body, I'm going to move down to the astromech droid that's below him. I'm going to use some grey sear just to tidy things up a little bit, but I'm going to avoid all those recesses. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of grey sear and matte white for the first set of highlights. And then finally, matte white just by itself for the final highlight. I'll then move back to Sabrine and I'll use Mechanicus Standard Grey once again just to neaten things up a little bit and to brighten the colour slightly. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Dawnstone. Then Dawnstone just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and Grey Sear for a little bit of an edge highlight on some of the bits that stick out more. For her boots and her arm pad and knee pad straps, I'm going to use some Eshin Grey to highlight those. Then I'm going to paint the inside of her trousers using some Wraithbone. I'll also use the Wraithbone to paint Hera's sleeves on her top. I'll then wash these areas with some Army Painter soft tone. While that wash dries, I'm going to move back to Chopper and I'm going to use some Jakaro orange to paint his head, which I'll wash with some Fulgurine orange. Once the wash on Hera and Sabrine has dried, I'm going to use some Wraithbone just to neaten things up a little bit. And then I'll give it a highlight with a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white. I'll then use Dryad bark to paint Hera's gloves, boots, armour and headgear, along with the outside of Sabrine's trousers and her gloves. Staying with Sabrine, I'm going to use some Mournfang brown to paint the straps, holsters and her belt. And these areas will all receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. To highlight Chopper's head, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Jakaro orange and matte white. I then use Sqaud yellow to paint the yellow details on Chopper. And then I very carefully gave those areas a wash with some Cassandora yellow. I then went back to the Dryad bark and lightened those areas up with a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothor brown. This was then followed up by Gothor brown just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Gothor brown and matte white for the final highlight. I then used Barak Nar Burgundy to paint the purple areas on Sabrine Wren, which I then washed with some Druchii Violet. While that dries, I moved back to Chopper, and I relayered the Flash Kits yellow, avoiding any of the recesses. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Flash Kits yellow and matte white for the highlights. I then moved back to Hera and painted any of the areas that were going to be white with some grey sear. These included a few straps, a few bits of armour, and bits of her headpiece. I then continued those with a 50-50 mix of grey sear and matte white, followed by a highlight of matte white just by itself. I then moved back to Sabrine and relayered the Barak Nar Burgundy with some Barak Nar Burgundy. I then used that same mouthful of a paint with some matte white for a 50-50 mix for the highlight. Next, I used some Sqaud brown to highlight the Mournfang brown of her holsters, and used Jakero orange to paint the remainder of her armour and one of her shoulder pads. The Jakero orange was washed with some Fuegryn orange, and I painted her other shoulder pad with some Dawnstone. I then moved on to all of the metal areas on the miniatures, and for that I used Iron Warriors. This is on things like pistols, buckles, and the open areas on Chopper. All of these areas were then washed with some Nuln Oil. I then did a 50-50 mix of Jakero Orange and Fire Dragon Bright to highlight Sabrine's orange sections. And then used a 50-50 mix of Fire Dragon Bright and Flash Kits Yellow to paint the circle areas on the actual orange itself. To finish off her armour, I used some matte white to paint a stripe on her knee pad and a couple of stripes on her chest plate. I then used some Fire Dragon Bright to dot areas around her boots to look like a few paint splashes. I then highlighted the Dawnstone section of her armour with a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and grey sear. Next I went and highlighted all the metal with a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver. And this was followed by a second highlight of Stormhost Silver just by itself. Starting work on Sabrine Wren's skin, I used some Cadian Flesh Tone, which I then washed with some Reikland Flesh Shade. For Hera's skin, I used some Deathguard Green. I then washed that with some Athonian Camo Shade. I then used some Lothern Blue to highlight certain sections on the Astromech droid. Next, I'll put my fingers in the way of the camera. I then painted the eyes with some Abaddon Black, followed by matte white, and then finally Abaddon Black again for the pupils. Once the wash had dried on Sabrine's skin, I then relayered the Cadian Flesh Tone with Cadian Flesh Tone. This was followed by a highlight of a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And then finally Kislev Flesh just by itself. I then got my knuckles in the way again and painted her hair with Abaddon Black. I also took the time to very carefully paint in some eyebrows. Her hair was then given a wash with some Nuln Oil. I then relayered Hera's skin with some Deathguard Green. This was then followed by a 70-30 mix of Deathguard Green and Wraithbone in favour of Deathguard Green. This was then followed by the same mix but at a 50-50 ratio. I then very carefully took the time to paint in her eyebrows with some Abaddon Black. Next I used some Dawn Yellow to paint the exhaust on Chopper, as well as the inner areas of the smoky sort of explosion that Sabrine's jumping from. This was then washed with some Cassandori Yellow. While that wash dried, I used a 50-50 mix of Jakero Orange and Fire Dragon Bright to paint Sabrine's hair, but just the front part. And then I gave that a wash with some Fuegryn Orange. Moving back to the clouds, even though the Cassandra yellow was still slightly wet, I still went ahead and painted with some Mechanicus standard grey. That way, if the yellow does blend in with it, it still looks more like more of the explosion is going off. I then stippled on some Dawnstone. If you don't know what stippling is, then basically it's when you sort of jab the paintbrush rather than use it to paint with, but you're still being very soft as you don't want to destroy or damage the paintbrush. I then used a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Dawnstone to continue that stippling, but just on the tips of the explosions. I then used Dawnstone to paint the concrete on the bases. And I used some Iron Warriors to paint the metal parts that are exploding out of the areas that Sabrine's standing on. Any mud was painted with some XV88. The concrete was then highlighted with some Grey Seer. The XV88 was highlighted with some Tau Light Ochre. This was followed by painting the rims of the bases with some Abaddon Black. And then finally, everything was given a wash with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. This also included the metal on Sabrine's base. Once that wash is dried, that's these guys finished. I've had an absolute blast painting them, but I do think it does suck that you have to pay effectively £90 if you want to get the full Rebels Sqaud. They didn't take too long either, only rocking in around about 6.5 hours to complete. The one that takes the longest time is Sabrine Wren because she's got lots of extra detail on her. But the beautiful thing about painting miniatures is if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. You can literally just stop at the basic colours. If you follow this guide, I really hope you found it useful, and if you want to see more, give the channel a subscribe, the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much again, and goodbye for now.